markets are like the goods market, the labor market, capital markets, firms. This is what we normally think of as markets, but I want to include the private sector in markets. And what markets do in modern society is enhance productivity, enhance efficiency for the most part, and also offer you choice. Now, this is not done in an entirely seamless way. There is waste in markets. There are periods of exuberance when a lot of investment goes into markets, and periods of fear when that investment goes waste and is destroyed. But by and large, it provides a more productive, efficient system and provides much more innovation and choice than the alternatives. And that's what we've seen through history. And that leads to the third pillar, which is the community. And by the community, I'm talking about the proximate neighborhood, village, municipality. That's what we think of as community. Of course, in cosmopolitan cities, sometimes the concept of neighborhood becomes less clear, especially in the modern day. But I want to talk about this as the historical locale for community action. And I want to include in this local government as well as its local institutions like schools. Right? Now, I want to argue that the community still has a role. The community often is a source of identity and a source of our values. If you grow up in Mylapore, you have a sense of who you are, which is different from if you grow up somewhere else, and you have a sense of what your values and your identity is. Now, the community does pretty much what the state does, but the state does it through a system of rights and duties. The community often does it by, not through some kind of a contractual or legalistic obligation, but by filling in the holes. So, if you lose your job and you no longer have any insurance, either commercial insurance or insurance from the state, your relative, your cousin, takes you into their house, not because they have a contractual obligation, but because they have a relationship with you, and they deliver on that relationship. So, a lot of the community is about filling in holes, not because of contracts, but because that's what a community is about. It's about relationships between people. And again, let me emphasize the community does not just have a role in filling in those holes, but also in political organization. And I'll come back to that in just a second. Now, why in this age of social media and Twitter and so on, why do I talk about the local physical community and not virtual communities? Why don't I talk about Facebook groups and so on? Well, those also could be communities, but I would argue they still are less effective than real communities, partly because increasingly we have the issue of trust. Is the person you're communicating with on the net a real person or a bot? Are they Indian, Chinese, Russian? Are they male, female? Neither, both? I mean, we don't know, because it's anonymous. And that limits the extent to which you can have trust in that communication. Similarly, the community has deep engagement. You cannot essentially avoid seeing your neighbor because you bump into them frequently, if nothing else, while watering your garden. You can opt out of any kind of virtual community. You can unfriend anybody you want to unfriend on Facebook. And so in that sense, the engagement is much lighter. And that's another way the community is stronger. But, you know, I think both can work together. And there's an interesting example in the book of how communities can actually work with the virtual. A developer in Toronto was trying to wire, this was in the early 2000s, wire his community together, create a local intranet. And it turns out he ran out of the ability to do that halfway, partly because of money, partly because of technological problems. So half the community was wired together and could use the internet, the other half was not and had a much harder time. And this was in the early days of private networks and so on. So Sociologists saw this and said this is an ideal experiment because we've wired half, we've not wired half, and this is completely random. So let me see, is the half that is wired in closer touch or the half that is not wired? And you could make arguments both ways. The internet allows you so much other sort of fun things to do. You don't pay attention to real people. That's one argument, and you hear that often. And the other is, well, maybe people can keep closer together because they can communicate more easily. Which one was right? Turns out the people who are wired tended to recognize their neighbors much more, tended to get together much more in real parties, tended to put search parties together for each other's children and dogs much more easily. And why could they do that? Because what happened was the overlay of the internet allowed for much easier communication, much easier getting together, because every time, for example, you had to have a party in the afternoon, you didn't have to knock on each door and say, shall we have a party, or phone everybody. Just sent an email around and said, come at 5 o'clock to Joan's house and we'll all party there. So communication became much more easy and traversed closed doors with the virtual. And so the broader point is, the virtual need not crowd out the real. Both can work together, and there are very strong communities. So, many of the young people here, for example, keep in really close touch with their classmates through various Facebook groups and so on. And that's an example of how your community, in fact, is stronger than perhaps our college community. We've lost touch much more easily because we don't have social media to keep